Welcome to the Eye on Innovation podcast, brought to you from OIS. I'm your host, Carey Powers, and I have the incredible opportunity, the best job, to get to talk to really smart, interesting people, and today is no exception. Today my guests are Yari Mitchell and Carey Kunst. Yari most recently served as the Chief Business Development Officer for AcuFocus, the small aperture company, acquired by Bausch Lomb in January of this year, and she is now heading up Y-Factor Consulting. Carey Kunst is the CEO of Aurion Biotech, whose lead candidate has the potential to be the first clinically validated cell therapy for the treatment of corneal endothelial disease. So welcome both of you. Thank you so much for making time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Carey.
So today our focus is on accessing capital and navigating M&A transactions. Yari and Greg couldn't be any more qualified to be our guest to talk about this subject. Yari spent nearly 13 years at AcuFocus before leading the charge on that transaction with B&L. And Greg led Aurion to a $120 million raise in April 2022. And that was undoubtedly a very, very difficult environment to be raising capital. You know, I know personally from my startup time as well. So I know our listeners are going to be on the edge of their seats taking notes while we explore this topic together today. So I think a really great place to start is with crafting the story. I think that is the absolute, most important critical factor when you're trying to sell your idea, right? Yeah. So both of your companies had such a radically different approach, scientifically speaking, to the problems that you're trying to solve. And so I wonder if you think that made it easier to sell to investors or more difficult to sell to investors, and how did you go about crafting that story? So Yari, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think for us, when I was at AcuFocus, bringing another intraocular lens to the market had its advantages and it had its challenges. An intraocular lens is known, but what wasn't known was the small aperture mechanism of action. So what we had to do was sort of prove that methodology. And then one of the things that we found that investors wanted to see is something that was fundamentally different, right? That was either going to be completely different and open up new markets, or it was going to be such a substantial change to current technology that it would be able to take market share and deliver value. So our goal was to, how do we identify with a new mechanism of action, how is our lens going to meet that requirement? So that's kind of where we started, and then it moved into working with physicians to craft that. So that's ultimately where we began.
Great.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in our case, we started from a different place in that cell therapy is very new to medicine, right? I mean, so I think that creates a bit of interest, but also creates a bit of challenge. And that challenge becomes, very few people understand cell therapy and the risks and benefits. And investors naturally, when they don't understand something, they get risk averse. Mm-hmm. And so I think on one hand, one can say, being very different is helpful because you want to be differentiated, to be able to raise money. On the flip side, sure, it cuts the other way in that it becomes a harder challenge to explain exactly what you do and why you're going to be successful at it. And we spent a lot of time, particularly with ophthalmology investors, educating them on cell therapy. Mm-hmm. Conversely, we spent on biotech investors, they wanted to dive in deep in things like CMC, manufacturing, and regulatory. So it depended on who we spoke with, but I definitely agree with Yari. You need to have a clear unmet need, and you got to be different. If you're the 25th prostaglandin analog or the 25th, monofocal IOL, the ability to raise money in this environment is really hard.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to overcome the barriers that exist within our channel, or the IOL channel in particular, is there's already so many lenses out there. They're all trying to do the same thing, deliver range of vision. But we've reached this sort of peak adoption, and we've been hovering at this space for such a long time. So, we were asked, how does this lens make a difference? How are you going to be the one that grows the market, takes share? And also, how are you going to stand up to the big players that have the budgets? Right. So.
Well, then also conversely, how do you exit in the sense of, as you guys successfully have done, you exited with a strategic when most of the strategics actually have their own R&D and IOLs. You have to be very different and very differentiated in that case to be successful.
Yeah, and which to me speaks to part of the story is you've got to be thinking through how are you going to take this product to market and compete? What are the pathways for reimbursement? And then make sure that you're crafting that on the front end as you're building your strategy and rolling it out. You've got to be very mindful. If your end goal is a strategic, how is it going to fit in the portfolio? How is it going to pull through other technologies? So yeah, you've got to be mindful of that. And I would imagine for you with your strategy, it's thinking forward with a blue ocean.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, because it's an area, it's a disease area that we haven't really done a lot in ophthalmology with, and secondly, it's a therapeutic class that is we're still trying to as an industry, we're still trying to figure out what's the role for cell therapy. How do we adopt it? How do we do it logistically? And so each opportunity has its own challenges, but I think. Like the message is, make sure that you're addressing a clear unmet need, and two, make sure that you make it very clear that as you look at the competitive set that you're different and you're addressing unaddressed questions with your technology.
Mm-hmm. So the headline is radical differentiation, I think we've come up with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's the answer. Mm-hmm. So as a startup, it's always such a delicate balance between being mindful of budgets, but also wanting to show up in a big way and differentiate yourself in the marketplace, have a voice, be a little loud. Mm-hmm. So what do you think are the areas that have been most critical for you to invest in outside of R&D, of course, right? Mm-hmm. But when you're trying to show up as a credible company, when you are, running on a tight budget, what do you think are the biggest areas of investment that are important? Greg, let's start with you this time.
Sure. I mean, we talk about our company's phase-appropriate investment. I mean, so when we're early, we're investing primarily in science, and then we start to pivot into clinicals. But the hard part becomes, to your I think the foundation of your question is, how do you do that and still have a big brand and keep interest? Because that is certainly important to raise money, and certainly important to try to exit the company. And so, I mean, I think where I tend to go there is making sure that you align yourself with the right KOL consultants and build the right MAB, because they're as much a part of your brand as your own company. And
absolutely,
at least in our industry, I mean, three of us all have deep experience in the industry. There's no secrets in this industry. So if you get the right people in place, I think by and large, the cream of the crop will always rise to the top.
Yeah. So the team, so phased appropriate investment, is that how you phrase it? Okay. Yari, what do you think?
Yeah, I love that. And I totally agree, Greg. One of the things that has been so helpful is to have those physician voices speaking into not only just the rest of their colleagues about your technology, but also helping you to advance that technology. But when I think about, what's the first thing that I think about in terms of getting my house in order is I always look back to the thought that you dress for the job that you want. Right? You dress for the job that you want. Mm-hmm. And that means that if I'm going to be presenting my company to an investor to give me millions of dollars, I need to look the part. I need to look like a professional organization. I need to be organized. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but you have to be diligent on the details. Even just your presentation is organized, that the color schemes match. I mean, little things like that can send a message of disorganization, start building layers of concern about the diligence that's needed, right? There's a lot of detail in what we do. And if, your presentation doesn't look organized, how can I trust you with my money to spend it on all the things you need to do to get a product to market? So I think dress for the job that you want. I would apply that to preparing for investment.
I love that. I mean, the devil's in the details. Mm-hmm. And when you're trying to show up in a big way and present to really important key investors, right? I mean, you just absolutely have to make sure that all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted. So that's a really good point. I like that. Mm-hmm. Very good. So, of course, startup life is never just all peaches and roses all the time. I'm sure that you both have faced some obstacles along the way. So what were the biggest obstacles in your path, and how did you overcome them? Yari?
Yeah. Wow. After having been with AcuFocus for 13 years, lucky number 13, and the organization had been around for over 20. So there's a long history, a deep history. So it's an overnight success, 20 years in the making is the constant joke. So in that lifetime, you go through so many different obstacles. There's near-death experiences. There's pivots that have to be made. At AcuFocus in particular, we started in the corneal inlay space, found that product needed to have have more time to get the organic growth and the learnings around working in the cornea. So we had to make the decision, do we as a venture-backed company have the resources to support commercial launch of a corneal inlay in the US while also developing an intraocular lens? Those are basically two different companies, two different startups housed under the same roof. So there was a point in time where we had to make a pivot and decide what direction we're going to go. And that was a hard one to make because we had invested all this time and energy in building the corneal inlay space. So we were able to transfer that over to the Cornea Gen team, then focus fully on the IOL and developing that because it deserved all the same amount of time and attention. So that for us was one of the biggest challenges, was making that complete change within the organization and keeping people energized through that change was one of the challenges, but I think that we weathered that storm.
I've never heard it referred to as near-death experiences. That's good.
Oh yeah.
So visual.
Yeah. Those things always happen, and I'm sure you've run into those where you think, oh, this data, that's it. It's not. This is going to be game over. But you persevere. You keep things in mind. I think you were mentioning that just the other day. I liked, I'd love. I think it'd be a good thing for you to share here your perspective. But yeah, just making sure you keep your eye on the prize.
Yeah, I mean, no startup goes without a near-death experience or two or three or maybe 10. I mean, I've been had the fortune to work for two now, between Glaucus in the early days and Aurion Biotech. And I think there were kind of three obstacles I look at in Aurion's early foundation that were key. I mean, one was we acquired a technology from Japan in the middle of a pandemic, just simply trying to tech transfer that from in a part of the world where Japan was locked down, and sugar Kaneshita wasn't readily available, during that period of time. So that was a challenge. I think two is, we're in a part of medicine where we have a drug that's with a cell therapy and a small molecule, and so we're trying to navigate from a regulatory standpoint between two different parts of the FDA, CBER and CDER. And when you talk to biotech people, they'll tell you, oh, you can't talk to the FDA. Conversely, in our world, at least with CDER, with Dr. Wiley Chambers, he's very open and accessible. And so we had a lot of interesting fights within our organization around, should we pick the phone up and call Wiley or not, right? And we laugh about that. We sit back and say, that seems kind of like a trivial thing, just pick the phone and call Wiley. And for people outside of our industry, that's just not something that they're accustomed to do. But what the FDA will tell you is, and frankly, the CDRH will tell the same thing. If you have a question, ask. And so many people are afraid to ask the question of the FDA, what about X? And they're usually pretty good about giving you an answer. You may not like the answer, but at least you have clarity. So I think that was the second. The third one is building the team. In cell therapy, because there's such a lack of experience in this area, there's just not a lot of people that you can draw upon, and the really large kind of frothy companies like people like Moderna, they get all the good talent, and then you got to go try to find. You got to try to go find it as an unknown company. Go find great people that have deep experience in an area that's like super narrow. And so those are the big obstacles early on for us.
Yeah, I think for us, a couple things that just you spurred my memory on was just making sure that whenever you hear information, it's never as good or as bad as first reported, right? That was actually on the wall in the office at AcuFocus, and that was sort of our North Star. That be mindful that it's information, and you just work any challenges that you come. And I think making sure you have a great team that works and gels well together and stays focused on the prize. That's where that's how you achieve the end goals that you want, is staying aligned and having a clear vision with people, like you say, that are talented, organized, and focused.
But I think your comment is important, because that's also how you remain emotionally stable during a startup, right? I mean, my dad had kind of a similar motto when I joined. My dad was a serial entrepreneur, and he said, when I joined this company, he said the same thing: is, Greg, it's never going to be as good or as bad as you think. And if I look at everything we've gone through with Aurion in the last 2 years, there were those moments I felt like, oh my goodness, we're at the end. And I tell my wife, I said, yeah, maybe we were going to have to sell the house in Seattle and just do something different.
Right.
But in the end, it's usually not that bad. But more so, it's so easy to get caught up in your own kind of your own like successes, or your own what you think are successes, and then you lose sight of reality, and that can be equally dangerous. So I think your comment on it's never as good as you think, it's never as bad as you think is absolute truth.
Yeah, which I think speaks to be open-minded and ready to pivot. right? Maybe you came into this with an idea about where your technology was going to go, but what you're learning is that maybe it serves a different need. And that's exactly what we ran into with the intraocular lens. When we started with the Apthera outside the United States, it was really an extended depth of focus technology. We thought we would be competing just purely in that channel, but as we saw surgeons starting to work with it, we learned that it addressed a completely different unmet need. So we could either continue to go down the original path, or we could listen to the surgeons and pivot. And ultimately, that made us better people and made the product better, and allowed it to have a longer life and to find a home with Bausch and Lomb. Yeah. So I think that open-mindedness, taking in information, allowed us to kind of overcome that barrier that we had for ourselves.
Those are great insights, and I love that. So that's the theme for this section of the interview. It's never as good or as bad as you think, so that's fantastic. So, speaking of all of these near-death experiences, working in a startup, especially leading a startup, can be really, really stressful. So how do you guys cope? How did you cope? What were your greatest coping mechanisms that, as you look back, really got you through those tough times?
Well, so fortunately, I live in Seattle. I'm a big skier, so as frequently as I could get up to slopes to take a little aggression out, because you've got to have some hobby or something that allows you to turn off, because these jobs you're on 100% of the time, and it'll grind you down if you're not careful. And so, finding a hobby, making sure you're able to disconnect with your family, taking care of your personal health. No one teaches you this when you take these jobs, but you learn it very quickly, or you'll burn out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yari, what do you think?
Similar. It's interesting. I'm a huge Peloton addict, so I definitely am a big believer that getting moving and having that sort of physical activity helps you to disengage from the what's happening in your brain, so that you're just focusing on one task. Because I think we're in this society that is very multitask oriented, and just really wants you to be constantly in motion, constantly engaged with social media, constantly engaged with people, and taking that moment to just kind of focus. And that's where I think fitness and skiing, any sort of physical activity, allows you to center around something that gives you time to breathe. Yeah, so I think those moments are important, but making sure you schedule them, sticking to a schedule, prioritizing them. If you can say you want to do it, but if you don't actively set a structure to have those opportunities, make sure they manifest, then you'll never get there. So you've got to be forward-thinking and diligent.
That is so true. That's what I find myself doing on Sundays, even just in bed right before, okay, let's get it on the calendar all week to make sure this happens. It doesn't always happen, but at least there was the intent, and maybe it happens 3 out of 5 times, right? But it's like a muscle, right? Every time you kind of start to think about this and plan it out into your schedule, you're going to continue to do that, and then it becomes second nature. So just like anything, building habits. Very good advice. So Yari, you recently made a career pivot with the B&L transaction, and you've recently started up Y Factor Consulting. So I'd just love to give you the platform to tell us a little bit about what that's all about.
Wonderful. Gosh, thanks, Carey. I appreciate that. So Y Factor Consulting was just born out of the idea that, first off, I learned so much through the AcuFocus experience. I've had tremendous mentors with Al Waterhouse, with Bill Link, Jim Mazo, and so many, that I really wanted to take those learnings and be able to help other small companies to take their idea from the lab and put it together in a package that could then seek funding to help people that are maybe early on in the development process to kind of accelerate that growth. So the way I think about Y Factor is I'm helping to empower innovators to take the next steps they need to in their business.
Empowering innovators. That's like your tagline, I think.
There you go.
And there's no one more qualified than Yari to do that.
It's fantastic.
Thank
You're going to be
you.
so successful, Yari. So wishing you the best with that.
Appreciate it.
So I do have one last question for you both. And I've been asking all my guests this today. So ChatGPT, we can't stop talking about it. I want to know, how are you using ChatGPT in your personal life? What is it helping you do more efficiently or effectively? How are you using it as a tool, if you are?
Oh my goodness. So ChatGPT has become a conversation point at my house. I think it comes up multiple times a day. My husband works for a 3D printing company, and he uses it quite a lot in the work that he does. And so it's a constant conversation. I've started using it to help with crafting social media posts. A good friend of mine who just started her own marketing firm, Jennifer Far Strategic, she's huge into ChatGPT
She
and
told
AI.
me about this. I've taken notes from Jenna too. She's got great ideas.
Yeah, so I think there's a real great opportunity to leverage AI for content development, but to me it's like anything else, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't know how to use the system, it's not going to be effective. So be forewarned, it's a double-edged sword. But I think I see it as an opportunity and look forward to leveraging it more personally.
So personally, have you used it for your personal life at all?
Oh yeah, actually, when I first started putting together like my resume, I was like, how can I make this sound stronger, right?
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so why not give yourself a leg up, a place to start?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
How about you, Greg?
So I'm kind of a nerd in the sense of, I wasn't very inquisitive most of my life. And so before ChatGPT, like I might go to Google and say, what is X, right? And you get like a long laundry list of links, but I might ask like a medical question, or I might be curious about what is this country, and you get this huge like almost like essay of sorts. You're like, oh wow, okay, and now I feel educated. I mean, and so I haven't found like a really good like actual like meaningful purpose of ChatGPT yet, but it's kind of, it fits my like gee whiz factor, like the Jeopardy knowledge of sorts.
Yeah, love it.
There's an interesting study that just came out, and I'm not going to have the right reference for it, so maybe we can add it afterwards.
Sure.
But they were talking about the use, there was a study done where they took questions that patients had submitted online, and they used ChatGPT to answer those questions, and also had physicians answer them. And then they had a survey with patients to see what answer did they prefer, the physician or the ChatGPT answer. ChatGPT was the winner.
Oh my goodness.
Right? So that's interesting, scary, but maybe an opportunity to use it.
Well, I think I saw that CNN as well, because I think the answer was much more empathetic from ChatGPT, which is kind of, you think to yourself, you wouldn't expect that. You would have thought the doctor would be more empathetic, but the AI was much better at connecting with patients.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Scary.
Yeah, it is scary.
To me, what it says is that physicians are overworked.
Yeah.
Right? There's so much happening, and to have that moment to connect with people is really difficult to find. And when I'm ChatGPT, I have infinite resources, and I'm focused purely on your answer. Of course, I'm going to do a great job. But I think that's where we just need more people coming into the space. We need better digital tools. We need better ways for patient education to happen. So maybe ChatGPT will be a helpful option for that. So.
Earlier today, we spoke with Dr. David Brew, the Global Chief Medical Officer from Microsoft, on this very subject. So
interesting.
Very, very timely. Well, this was a fantastic discussion. Again, thank you so much for carving out time for it. I'm Carey Powers, the host of Ion Innovation for OIS.